Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. And sometimes I even talk about normal literature, because if it is important to me. And today I wanted to focus on something of that sort, a book that I had read recently for the book club that I am a part of with my friend Bevan, who so often recommends high quality literature. And today I'm going to be talking about a book that focuses on the child welfare system in America. I am referring to Torn Apart: How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World, quite a long subtitle, by Dorothy Roberts, which was published in 2022. For those who don't know, Dorothy Roberts is an American author. She is a sociologist and a social justice advocate. Her work frequently centers on Black Americans in the child welfare system, as you can see in this book, but she's also focused on policing and the prison system, which is a large focus of her work. That you saw in that she said that she worked on in the 1990s. And she's done other work that's focused on HIV and AIDS and in the Caribbean or among Caribbean immigrants as well. Quite a lot of work, quite a lot of body of work. I don't think she's really that much of an author. Here you can see she's written something, but I think that's more the byproduct of her wanting to get her research out there rather than her wanting to write a book, which I've seen in a couple other authors that I've talked about on this channel who focused on more scientific related stuff. And in addition to writing books, she's also gotten her work published in numerous journals and articles, and she's given TED Talks as well. And so she's a very fascinating writer, won a number of awards and honors for her studies and for what she's contributed to the field. And I think her work here is pretty impressive. And so without further ado, let's talk about Torn Apart. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Torn Apart focuses on the child welfare system, particularly focusing on child protective services or the state equivalents throughout the United States. She begins with a story about a woman named Vanessa. Vanessa is a woman who had cancer and was hanging out at the park with her family when one of her children wandered off. Vanessa quickly saw the child and ran up to them, but by the time she got to the child, a white woman had found the child and reported the child to the police, saying that it was abandoned, even though the child clearly wasn't. And when the police arrived, they ticketed Vanessa for child neglect, which is largely unfair, and she came into contact with the Child Protective Services as a result. And one day they visited her house, and she was downstairs and she was hard of hearing, so she couldn't really tell that they were there. But her child was upstairs peering out the window, and Child Protective Services saw this, and because she wasn't coming to the door, they felt that they had to call the police. And so the police arrived, got inside and saw that Vanessa was downstairs, demanded to know why she hadn't answered, and when she said she was hard of hearing and whatnot, they demanded to know why she was raising the child on her own, and she said that she was receiving help from her family. Ultimately, this all led to a big scuffle where the police threw her on the ground, dislocated her shoulder, and took her to jail, and in the process, she was kind of separated from her children. But eventually, she was able to sue the city, but she has a mark on her record saying that she was a child abuser because her attorney, her public defender made her go about doing that. And so Roberts uses this as an example of how many things are wrong with the system at large. Because this isn't just happening to Vanessa, it's happening to a lot of people. And Vanessa, Roberts goes on to talk about how Black families are overrepresented in CPS systems, even in states where there's not a whole big Black population. There are still Black families who are often targeted more than other families. And then she talks about how this results in family separation a lot of the time because CPS's remedy is always to separate the child from the family. And this results in a lot of trauma and ill health effects, especially psychological, for both the parents and the children, because it turns out separating people who love each other like that and need each other most often is not a good thing to do, especially when there's no actual abuse happening and it's just at the CPS's discretion. Roberts also notes how there's a double standard for the wealthy and how the CPS system at large has its roots in slavery because the white masters would separate child slaves from the adult slaves once they were born, and loan them out to other people or whatnot, or straight up sell them. And then after slavery was ended, the laws created by white Southerners in order to disenfranchise the blacks who still lived in the South, they took children away in order to do apprenticeships where, again, the white masters could do anything they want with the children. And so that separated families. And then there's also roots in the treatment of indigenous individuals in America, where both the United States and Canada would straight up take children away from their families, send them to boarding schools, or just let other families adopt them in order to beat the Indian culture out of those individuals. And a large problem that Vanessa notes is this is a well-funded system. No one wants to be the governor who takes away funding from CPS, so they're constantly funding it and giving it more money to make it like this bloated organization. And it's also profitable because a lot of people within the system are making money and want it to continue because they're making money. And the system also gets some money from the families, because when they take children away, sometimes the families are sued for alimony and whatnot, and so they have to pay, and it keeps the system well funded as well. And there's also a system of mandated reporters, which often prevents people of color from accurately reporting their lives, because if they report the wrong thing, they might have their children taken away. Then there's also a digital surveillance state, which between the computers and the Zoom meetings that took place during the pandemic and the algorithms that are created to detect child abuse in targeted areas, that reveals a lot of bias against Black people in this system. Roberts also goes on to talk about the foster care abuses that exist in the system, and the direct harm that is done towards teenagers, especially teenagers of color, and how a lot of agencies that are known abusers in the system are still given foster children to care for, either because the CPS system doesn't really care at all, or they're willing to hide it in order to ignore the fact that there aren't any other organizations really willing to do the work. And this also creates a problem of delinquency in the foster care system, where it's pretty much a pipeline from being in foster care to prison, which again creates a problem with the prison system and jailing Black individuals as well. And then Roberts ultimately ends this by calling for a total dismantling of the CPS, because you can't fix what technically isn't broken. The CPS system is working as intended to separate Black families and disrupt Black individuals. So the only answer is to just get rid of it entirely and fill it, or take something that could take its place is societal reforms and community engagement and mutual aid. And that's really where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there is a fair bit to talk about here. I know this is a nonfiction type of read, but there are still main points that are worth discussing that I kind of iterated earlier in the summary section, but are worth repeating and discussing when when considering the child welfare system. One idea that Roberts frequently talks about is CPS and racism, the bias that inherently exists in the system. And she notes this through highlighting how there's an over-policing and over-monitoring of Black families, how especially in locations where people of color are in the minority, there's still a large number of Black families being separated, like children being taken away from the families. And I think at some point you have to make an argument that this either indicates that Black families are doing a whole lot of abuse, which doesn't quite make sense, because why would they be predisposed when there's no real difference, biological difference among the races, or that there's someone being targeted. Like there's a selective notion here where whenever you see a Black family as a social worker, you might assume that something is going wrong. And the role that poverty plays, especially how society keeps Black families in poverty and then targets those who are in poverty by saying that, like, oh, you're a bad parent if your child lives in poverty. It's not really like the parents' fault that they're in poverty. It's a system-wide poverty. Like, it's a system's choice to allow this to exist. And yet they're still going to target these families because of the inherent racism and even elitism that exists within the system. And you also see the historical roots going back to slavery and then the Jim Crow era, and how we've just allowed this to continue. The powers that be have allowed it to continue, really, because clearly, like, not everyone is okay with this. And the idea of like adopting Black children and saving them from the squalor they grew up in is inherently racist. Especially noted in one story where like one white parent was saying that my baby was born with like drugs in their system, which doesn't sound accurate at all, and is merely a way to gain sympathy and clout online, which this influencer culture that we have going on is surely going to produce a lot of like unfortunate adoption stories down the road as well. And that leads to further abuse of Black children, which we see in the foster care system. And ultimately, these are all, as Roberts notes, like, these are all extensions of the police and prison systemic issues that are faced, where Black people are targeted, put into prison and disenfranchised, and like their voting rights are taken away. They're not seen as equal members of society. And like, you could argue that this is the end goal, like that by putting Black children into the foster care system, your end goal is to put them in prison so they can become disenfranchised. Like, you start by targeting their fathers during the war on drugs, even though you funneled drugs into the system in the first place, as we can see, like Nixon and the CIA actually did that. And then, like, once you targeted the black fathers, you go after the Black mothers by calling them unfit parents. And then once you do that, you either send the children to white parents to completely decimate Black culture within that child and teach them the ways of the dominant culture, or you just put them in an unhealthy foster care system that teaches them bad values and leads to them inevitably going to prison because they have no support system. And you've completely decimated the Black population in this case, which is not some conspiracy theory, because this has happened to Native Americans in the past. Several presidents have gone on record as saying that they were doing this because nobody told them that that was a bad thing to do at the time. And that's exactly what seems to be happening with the foster care system. And to combine all this with the newer technology that's being used with algorithms designed to locate communities where child abuse might be happening, and then finding out that, oh, these communities are also Black, it seems like the technology being used and the the algorithms being created are inherently biased towards people of color. But that's something that Silicon Valley and the politicians who regulate this sort of technology need to do in order. But again, that's something that's really hard to do if the system is working as intended. Again, like, a lot of these ideas might seem radical for Dorothy Roberts to talk about, but they're not that radical when you know the history of the United States. Like, another idea that Roberts is talking about here is the vast power of the child welfare system, where it seems to be like unchecked. Nobody's really monitoring it unless it starts doing something wrong. Like, oh no, a child got abused. Let's check into this. But if those stories aren't popping up, you're not going to do anything to monitor it. So social workers often go unchecked, and if there's any bias with those social workers, well, the only evidence is going to be in the statistics, and the statistics really do show that. But again, if the politicians don't care, they're not going to look at those statistics. And I like how Roberts points out that there's a lot of Fourth Amendment violations here. How like the algorithms that are in place, like create these due process violations, and often just taking their children away. It's not offering them an opportunity for a fair trial. You're just assuming like, oh, these children are bad. You have to be separated, or like, oh, these parents are bad. You have to separate them from the children, and that's it. And it's like, there's no say in the parents in this matter. Nobody's stepping in to say, hey, let's do a trial about this. It's just automatically assuming that those social workers are right, which is vastly unfair. And the question is, like, who are they accountable to? As I noted before, like, they're kind of accountable to nobody. They exist solely to separate families, and it doesn't matter who they separate. There's an interesting quote that I would like to read to you from this. Precisely because it seems to operate outside criminal law enforcement, the child welfare system has become an extremely useful arm of the carceral state, for it has the power to intensively monitor entire communities, all the while escaping public scrutiny and bypassing legal protections by claiming to protect the children of those communities. Which is a good quote. Like, if this is supposed to be a function of the carceral state and keep people of color oppressed, then it's doing exactly what it does. And if you say, oh, well, we're just protecting children, you don't want to know what happens if we don't exist, like, that keeps a lot of society like off your back, because what if you go away? You don't want like, parents don't want their children to be harmed. And so, like, with that vast amount of power and no one to check it, it's not being regulated, and no one's really stopping to think, at least nobody with power is stopping to think that maybe this is a bad system. And you can see how that's going to lead to so many problems. It's led to so many problems in the past when systems go unchecked like this. I really like how Dorothy Roberts also highlights opportunities for reform or abolition. Like, I don't think it's enough to simply say that this is a problem, because I think a lot of people know that it is somewhat a problem. But what can we do in its place in order to fix it, in order to make sure that this doesn't continue to happen for everyone, especially Black families? And Roberts notes that, like, one thing that you can help is use community aid and helping families. So whenever this does happen, the community is there to offer money and help and prevent, like, family separation from happening for an extensively long time. And then you could also say, like, let's offer training for individuals who are in this system, like social workers and police officers, so there isn't a bias. And that feels like the stereotypical answer that's also been offered in the police system. And as Robert notes, like, that's not going to be good enough. Like, tinkering with the system is not good enough in itself. You have to abolish it, because the original intention was to separate Black families, and it's doing exactly what it's intended for here. There's another good quote that I would like to read to you. Why does the United States continue to invest billions of dollars in a broken system that fails so miserably at protecting children? Because the system is not broken. Those in power have no interest in fundamentally changing a system that is benefiting them financially and politically, one that continues to serve their interest in disempowering Black communities, reinforcing a white supremacist power structure, and stifling calls for radical social change. And that's a fascinating quote, because it shows that, like, politicians don't really want to do anything about this. Like, you can fix it little by little, but that does nothing if the system is designed to oppress and make things worse. And the ultimate answer is to just abolish it completely, using either universal basic income to make sure that families are lifted out of poverty and that there might not be necessary visits from CPS, or even stuff like mutual aid, where communities come together and work to either keep CPS out of their community or prevent the conditions from CPS, like leaping on families and causing this type of harm. As Roberts notes, she also notes a very good point, like that this can take cues from the prison abolition movement, where it's necessary to shrink the system rather than to outright abolish it, because you're never really going to abolish it right away or overnight, because you're going to face too much opposition, and to just get rid of it overnight denies that like it's like so entrenched in the system right now, and if you take it out, like there's going to be a power vacuum. But what you can do is shrink it until it becomes unrecognizable. Take apart piece by piece, have it fulfilled by other roles and other organizations in the community until that all that's left is a shadow of its former self. And in that way, it's great, because the radical conservatives or fascists who want to keep it in place are going to be focused on you trying for the big moves rather than the small moves first. And by the time like they realize what you're doing, hopefully it's going to be too late. And it's much easier to fix things little by little. Of course, a lot of people want like vast systemic change now, but I think a lot of people fail to realize that valuable and necessary social change takes years to accomplish rather than being instantaneous, which is something I have a problem with myself. And I really like how Roberts addresses this in her book. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Torn Apart by Dorothy Roberts, a really good read about the child welfare system and the problems that are inherent in it. She discussed a lot of things that I didn't have time to talk about in this video. It would simply be an incredibly long video, because there's a whole bunch of stuff that she mentioned about like the racist elements and the in Black community, how it's existing and sold in Black communities, and there's a lot to talk about with what it does to people like in the foster care system. Like that's an entire sort of thing worth talking about, but I didn't have time for that. But I encourage you to read this and check it out and let me know what you think in the comments below. Otherwise, if you've already read this, comment below. Let's have a discussion about Torn Apart or even Dorothy Roberts. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this book or this author or even just this wide issue, because it's always important to raise awareness about such problems that exist in the world. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and abolitionist travels. Farewell.